Hi, I'm Pastor Steve Talmage of Love of Christ Lutheran Church in Mesa, Arizona. Each week, Pastor Nanette Christofferson and I try to provide a brief look at two of the Bible readings assigned for the upcoming Sunday. We're going to look in this lesson at the Gospel, Matthew 17, 1-9, and it's for Transfiguration of our Lord Sunday, February 19th, 2023, last Sunday of Epiphany. You might recall the season of Epiphany has the focus of revealing to the disciples, revealing to all who hear the text of the season, Jesus is the Son of God. We started with baptism, we started with the Magi showing up on the day of Epiphany, but the first Sunday of Epiphany is the baptism of our Lord. In Matthew's account, God declares out to the public who are at the baptism of Jesus, "This is my Son with whom I'm well pleased." And now we come to the last Sunday, the bookend, and it's Transfiguration Sunday, where we again hear the voice of God declaring who Jesus is. This is the message in those who created the church calendar year to lead us into the season of Lent, where the fullness of who Jesus is will be revealed through his death and resurrection. All right, context. We have first, no one knows exactly where the Mount of Transfiguration is located. If you go to the Holy Land, there'll be sites designated as the spot. Church, there's a Church of Transfiguration there. In 16 verses 13-20, Jesus is on retreat with his disciples up at Caesarea Philippi, and so I have a map here for you so you can see we're due north, straight north of the Sea of Galilee, up in kind of the mountainous area. It's a pretty area. There's a lot of vegetation, higher altitude. And there he inquires who the people say he is and who the disciples say he is. And we know, many of us know the story. Peter wins the prize for confessing, "You are the Christ. You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Again, Jesus is the Son of God. Then we go to chapter 16, verses 21-28. And Jesus speaks of his suffering, his death, and resurrection. Peter rebukes Jesus hearing those words, and then Jesus comes right back at him and rebukes Peter with, "Get behind me, Satan." And it's interesting, we've not seen Satan, the tempter, the tester, since Jesus' temptation in the wilderness back in Matthew chapter 4. But here again, as Jesus announced what lies ahead of him, we see there's the temptation. Jesus, are you really going to do what you say you did? That is going to happen to you? And then, following this, Jesus gives his call to discipleship. And we hear that the call to discipleship, which probably doesn't sell too well in our 21st century, particularly in our consumptive lifestyle in America, deny oneself, take up a cross, follow Jesus, lose one's life for his sake, and turn away from the world. Wow, those are heavy elements of what it means to walk in the footsteps of Jesus. But if you and I are to look at church history, and we look at the people who have passed on the faith from generation to generation, elements of all of that are there. And we have the privilege of worshiping the living Lord, the resurrected Lord, because of folks who took up the cross, who chose to follow Jesus, who gave up their life for Jesus' sake. They were martyred for the faith. And they turned away from the world because they knew that this world that we're living is not the end, and it's temporary. Chapter 17, leading up to our lesson. 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and his brother John. I don't know why Andrew doesn't get included, because we have Andrew as part of the early fishing brother teams, but somehow he doesn't get included. But they're led up to a high mountain. Whenever you hear a high mountain in the Bible, you need to understand it's a place where revelation is going to happen. If you're going to go meet the Lord, meet Yahweh, meet God, you go to a high place. And if other religions too, you would see the high places are where revelation is brought, and where the gods and the goddesses dwell are up in the high places. So They go up by themselves. Matthew makes it clear. Nobody else is with them. And then he was transfigured. And we had this actual change in appearance. And his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became dazzling white. So we see this kind of, brightness. And a lot of image of revelation comes when we talk about bright, light, sun, shining, all that kind of stuff. And remember, last week, the lesson that Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount talks about the disciples being the light of the world, or 2 weeks before, that Jesus is the light of the world, or that we are the light of the world. And then suddenly, there appeared to them Moses and Elijah talking to Jesus. Again, for Peter, James, and John, for the disciples, for the early Christian community, primarily those who were Jewish, who chose to follow Jesus, when they hear Moses and they hear Elijah, these are the two representatives of the Sinai covenant that's in our first lesson, the Ten Commandments, Moses being the lawgiver, and Elijah being the first prophet called by God to speak on God's behalf to the people of God, to reveal and show what God is up to. So they're talking with Jesus. And remember, Jesus talks about being the fulfillment of the law. And throughout Matthew, you have the reference, this was said or this was done in order to fulfill what had been said before. Usually it's Isaiah, but some of the other prophets as well. Then Peter speaking on behalf, and in Matthew, Peter is often the spokesperson. He's declared, upon this rock I will build the church, because of your confession of who Jesus is. Peter is seen in the Catholic Church as the first pope. So Peter, though he's a little thick-headed, and we know he's going to deny Jesus during Holy Week, but then Peter's going to become a key leader to the movement of Christ, the way of Christ, up until his death. So Peter says, Lord, it's good for us to be here. If you wish, I'll make 3 dwellings here, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. And dwellings is shelter, tent, tabernacle, this whole idea of let's build a place where we can gather together, spend time together, and be together. And some of us, maybe in our own walk with Christ, have had mountaintop experiences. Maybe we've had these moments where we felt extremely close to God, an intimacy there that we just want to hold on to. Or we've had some sort of spiritual experience that we just don't want to see end. This is a spiritual experience. This is an awesome experience. This is an awe-striking experience. And Peter says, let's hold on to this. Let's hold on to this. But God's not done yet. We get a theophany. We have an appearance of God through what we saw in our Old Testament reading. While he was still speaking, Peter was still speaking, suddenly a bright cloud overshadowed them. Again, cloud, symbolic of the mysterious nature of God. You can't contain God in any kind of finite form. And here we have this ethereal kind of appearance of God in a cloud. And from the cloud, a voice said, again, the second time that we hear the direct voice of God, this is my Son, the beloved. Repeat of what we heard earlier at the baptism of Jesus. Beginning of the 3 years, end of the 3 years, Matthew wants his audience to know Jesus is God's Son, the beloved. With him I'm well pleased. And then we have this commandment, a declaration. Listen to him. Listen to him. When the disciples heard this, they fell to the ground and were overcome by fear. And this is, out of Old Testament imagery. You might remember the call of Isaiah. God appears on his throne, and you've got all sorts of heavenly bodies and images going on there. And Isaiah is, just overwhelmed with a sense of unworthiness. And I think that's part of the thing that we have to understand when we're talking about dealing with God. Humility is going to happen, because we're going to be so overwhelmed with who God is. And our temptation is to always kind of box God in to make God manageable. But here, the disciples, when they hear the voice of God after seeing the experience of Jesus and Moses and Elijah, their normal and I would say natural human response is fall to the ground, and we're overcome by fear. And that fear can be unpacked in, they could be overwhelmed with being afraid, or it could be just with just sheer awe and reverence for what's going on here. We don't know for sure, but we know that they are privy to something extraordinary, and their response is basically to just fall down, be silent, and wonder what's next. Then we get the gift, and the gift is that Jesus came and touched them. Jesus came and touched them, saying, get up and do not be afraid. Think about a time that you maybe as a child had this horrific nightmare, and I'm not calling transfiguration a nightmare, it's a positive thing, but where you couldn't speak, you were just kind of terrified, and somehow you croaked out a cry, and your mother or father came and they touched you. They assured you you were not alone. And as so often in the Old Testament and New Testament, we get words from angels, from God, from prophets, from Jesus. Do not be afraid. God, Jesus, does not want the followers of Jesus to be afraid. We are to be courageous. We're to be brave. We're to be confident. And when they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus himself alone. Again, they're tripping, When we think about people who've done psychedelic drugs, they are tripping in the sense of what they just experienced, what their bodies reacted to, and they're wondering what on earth is going on here. But the one thing that's certain and sure is Jesus physically touched them and assured them, don't be afraid. And he told them to get up, to get up. Don't get stuck in your fear. Don't get stuck in this moment, because boys, we got some work to do. And so we have verse 9. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus ordered them, tell no one about the vision until after the Son of Man has been raised from the dead. Some might say, well, why doesn't Jesus want them to tell? Again, part of the dynamic and challenge of the crowds and the disciples is, what is our faith based on? Jesus being a miracle worker, Jesus being a fantastic teacher and preacher, and there's a part here, if they come out and start talking about what they experienced, most of the people aren't going to believe them. They're going to think they ate some bad mushrooms, or they hit their heads on a rock. And we don't need more controversy as they're going into Holy Week. And there's a piece here also that after Jesus has died and risen, this is small potatoes. And it's a reaffirmation that Jesus is God's Son who died and rose and fulfilled all that the law said and all that the prophets said. As you go into this Transfiguration Sunday, as we conclude the season of Epiphany, hold on to who Jesus is. And also, as you hold on to who Jesus is, be aware of what we often try to make Jesus into, because that's going to be a challenge for the disciples and the crowds as we get closer and closer to that day we call Good Friday. God bless you. Thanks for watching. Take care.